Imagine a land of 13 struggling colonies, barely surviving, fighting starvation, sickness, and fierce winters. Now, fast forward a few centuries, one of the most powerful nations in the world. What changed? How did a ragtag group of settlers evolve into a superpower shaping global events? Today, we're unraveling a story packed with bold risk-takers, bloody wars, epic discoveries, and political revolutions. This isn't just history. It's an adventure that reshaped the world. From Plymouth Rock to the White House, from Civil War battlefields to the moon landing, this journey is bigger than any single moment. And it all started with people who dared to imagine something greater than themselves. If you've ever wondered how the course of history bent toward this remarkable transformation, you're in the right place. Stick around, because the rise of the United States is a saga of grit, ambition, conflict, and innovation. And you're about to see how a handful of colonies became a global powerhouse. Long before the United States existed, European powers were exploring the unknown edges of the world. Spain, France, and England were racing for land, wealth, and influence. The promise of gold, fur, and fertile soil drove explorers across dangerous seas to the vast lands of North America. These early expeditions weren't just about discovery. They were strategic moves in a game of global domination. England sent settlers to establish colonies where they could grow crops, trade goods, and expand their empire. It wasn't an easy task. Harsh weather, hostile terrain, and pressure from rival powers made survival difficult. Yet the early colonies, Virginia, Massachusetts, and others, laid the first stones of what would eventually become the United States. These settlements not only survived, but became hubs of commerce and culture. As more people arrived, the idea of creating entirely new societies took root. And while the Europeans saw opportunity, indigenous nations saw disruption, beginning centuries of conflict, adaptation, and profound change. By the early 1700s, 13 distinct British colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. Each had its own society, economy, and ambitions. The New England colonies focused on trade and community life, built around town meetings and local governance. The Middle colonies, with fertile soil and diverse settlers, became centers of agriculture and commerce. Down south, plantations grew cash crops like tobacco and rice, relying heavily on enslaved labor. Though all under British rule, these colonies began to develop unique identities, different ways of life shaped by geography and culture. With thousands of miles between them and a distant king, colonists started solving problems themselves. Town councils, colonial assemblies, and local courts became powerful institutions. Before long, colonists weren't just living in the new world, they were shaping it. They traded with one another, fought together against threats, and debated how society should work. These early seeds of self-government were crucial because they planted ideas that would later blossom into full-blown demands for independence. The colonies were no longer simply British outposts. They were evolving political communities. Life in the colonies wasn't all sunshine and harvests. As colonies prospered, tensions with Britain intensified. Across the Atlantic, the British Crown expected the colonies to pay taxes to help cover the cost of wars and administration. But colonial leaders protested, arguing that distant lawmakers shouldn't tax people who had no voice in Parliament. No taxation without representation became a rallying cry. Everything from sugar and stamps to tea became battlegrounds of protest. British troops stationed in American ports clashed with local workers. Anger simmered into rebellion. These disputes weren't only economic, they were philosophical. Colonists started questioning authority. They read pamphlets and speeches arguing that government should protect natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Ordinary people, farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, began seeing themselves as citizens with rights, not subjects under a distant king. Tensions escalated. What started as complaints about taxes grew into accusations of tyranny. Britain saw loyalty and order. Many colonists saw injustice and oppression. Soon, talk of separation moved from fringe to mainstream. The stage was set for a revolution that would shake the world. In April 1775, the spark finally ignited. Shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, the first battles of the American Revolution. These weren't just military clashes, they were symbolic acts of defiance. From that moment, peaceful protest gave way to armed resistance against British rule. Leaders like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams stepped forward, determined to unite the colonies in a bold fight for freedom. Washington was appointed commander of the Continental Army, charged with uniting poorly trained volunteers against the world's greatest military power. Throughout the brutal war years, colonial forces endured hunger, harsh winters, and repeated defeats. Yet their resilience was remarkable. Fighters weren't only motivated by land or pay, they believed in an idea that people deserved self-government and freedom from tyranny. Battles at Bunker Hill, Saratoga, and Yorktown turned the tide, proving the revolution was no mere rebellion, but a force with momentum and purpose. Finally, in 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, effectively ending major combat and proving the impossible was possible. The United States was born not just through arms, but through an unshakable belief in its future. After independence, victory posed a new challenge: how to govern a nation stitched together by 13 diverse and often conflicting states. The first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, failed to create a strong central authority. Trade disputes erupted, debts piled up, and rebellion stirred, most famously with Shays' Rebellion. Leaders realized that a stronger framework was needed. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia brought together delegates to design a new system. They crafted a constitution that balanced power between states and a federal government, protected individual rights, and created a separation of powers. The result? A presidency, a Congress, and a judiciary, a model that still exists today. But it wasn't perfect. It excluded women, enslaved people, and many non-landowners from political participation. Still, it was a daring experiment in self-rule. For the first time in modern history, a large republic was built on laws, debate, and democracy, not kings or conquest. This foundation allowed the new nation to unify, defend itself, and eventually expand far beyond the original colonies. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry when Americans began turning their eyes westward. The idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand across the continent, began to shape national policy. Vast tracts of land once home to indigenous nations were claimed, purchased, or seized. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which doubled the size of the country overnight, was a game changer. Thomas Jefferson bought it from France, opening new paths for exploration and settlement. Lewis and Clark's expedition charted the unknown, igniting the imagination of countless settlers. But expansion wasn't just about opportunity, it was also about conflict. Native American tribes were forced from their lands, often violently. The trail of tears, Indian wars, and broken treaties left scars still felt today. Yet for many Americans at the time, expansion meant progress. New states, booming trade, and a growing sense of national identity. The frontier hardened the American character, rugged, restless, and relentless. It helped create a self-image that persists, a land of opportunity where ambition could carve out a future. As the 19th century progressed, America underwent another transformation, not territorial, but technological. The Industrial Revolution swept across the Atlantic, changing how Americans worked, lived, and produced goods. Factories sprang up in northern cities, churning out textiles, steel, and tools. Railroads crisscrossed the country, connecting markets and communities like never before. Telegraph lines sped up communication, while steam engines powered ships and trains. The U.S. economy shifted from agriculture to industry, and cities swelled with workers seeking jobs. But this new era brought massive inequality. Factory labor was grueling. Children toiled alongside adults. Poor working conditions and long hours sparked early labor movements and calls for reform. Still, innovation exploded. Inventors like Eli Whitney, Samuel Morse, and later Thomas Edison turned ideas into infrastructure. Meanwhile, waves of immigrants arrived. Germans, Irish, Italians, adding diversity and fueling growth. America was no longer just a nation of farms and frontiers. It was becoming a manufacturing giant. The wealth and power generated by industry gave the U.S. leverage on the global stage, a crucial step toward its future as a superpower. While the North industrialized, the South clung to its plantation economy and to slavery. Millions of enslaved African Americans were forced to labor in brutal conditions, generating immense wealth for white landowners. As the country expanded west, a bitter question tore at the nation's soul. Would new states allow slavery? Compromise after compromise tried to delay the inevitable, but tensions boiled over. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who opposed slavery's spread, was the final straw for Southern states. 11 of them seceded, forming the Confederate States of America. The Civil War erupted in 1861, pitting brother against brother in a conflict that would claim over 600,000 lives. More than a war over Union versus secession, it was a battle over human freedom. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 turned the tide, redefining the war's moral purpose. After 4 brutal years, the Union prevailed. Slavery was abolished, but racial injustice would persist for generations. Still, the Civil War settled 2 things. The United States would remain united, and its founding promise, liberty and equality, would be tested, reshaped, and expanded. After the Civil War, the U.S. faced a massive question: how to rebuild a shattered nation. The South lay in ruins. Freed African Americans sought opportunity and protection. The federal government embarked on a bold, turbulent effort known as Reconstruction. New amendments to the Constitution granted citizenship, equal protection, and voting rights to formerly enslaved people. For a brief moment, Black Americans held political office, opened businesses, and built communities. But resistance was fierce. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used violence and terror to suppress progress. Southern states passed black codes, and later Jim Crow laws to strip away rights. The federal government eventually pulled out of the South in 1877, ending Reconstruction. The promise of racial equality was betrayed, and segregation would dominate for nearly a century. Yet Reconstruction mattered. It planted seeds of change, showed that transformation was possible, and highlighted the fierce backlash that comes with progress. The struggle between justice and power, freedom and fear, would become a recurring theme in America's journey and fuel future fights for civil rights. By the late 1800s, the United States was booming, but beneath the surface, tensions brewed. This era, known as the Gilded Age, was marked by rapid economic growth, technological innovation, and staggering inequality. Industrial titans like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt amassed massive fortunes, building monopolies in oil, steel, and railroads. Skyscrapers climbed into city skies, and Wall Street became the nerve center of capitalism. But this wealth wasn't evenly shared. Factory workers labored in dangerous conditions for low pay, while child labor was widespread. Corruption infiltrated politics, and business leaders used their influence to sway elections and policy. Cities were controlled by political machines, trading favors for votes. Meanwhile, immigrants poured in by the millions, chasing the American dream, only to find overcrowded tenements and brutal jobs. Labor unions began organizing strikes, demanding better treatment. This tension between progress and exploitation defined the age. The U.S. was no longer just growing. It was transforming into a complex industrial society. And with growth came questions. Who benefits? Who's left behind? And what kind of nation would America become? As the 19th century closed, America looked outward. The frontier was declared closed. But ambition didn't stop. A new wave of imperialism began, with the U.S. seeking influence and territory beyond its borders. The Spanish-American War in 1898 marked a turning point. In just a few months, the U.S. defeated Spain and took control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. It wasn't just about land. It was about power. America was flexing its muscles on the global stage, and President Theodore Roosevelt embodied this new swagger. With his big stick diplomacy, he pushed for a powerful navy, built the Panama Canal, and declared the U.S. the dominant force in the Western Hemisphere. This expansion came with contradictions. America had fought for freedom from empire, yet now it was becoming an empire itself. In places like the Philippines, resistance movements rose against U.S. control. At home, Americans debated, was this the fulfillment of destiny or a betrayal of founding ideals? Either way, the message was clear. The United States was no longer just a nation. It was becoming a global player. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States initially stayed out. President Woodrow Wilson promised neutrality, reflecting a long-standing reluctance to get entangled in foreign wars. But by 1917, that changed. German submarine attacks on American ships, along with the infamous Zimmermann telegram, pushed the U.S. into the conflict. American troops, the Doughboys, arrived in Europe, helping tip the balance in favor of the Allies. The war effort transformed the U.S. at home as factories roared and propaganda fueled national unity. Women entered the workforce in new numbers, and the nation's industries shifted into overdrive. When the war ended in 1918, Wilson dreamed of a new world order guided by peace and cooperation. His League of Nations was a bold idea, but Congress rejected it. America pulled back into isolation, wary of global entanglements even as its influence had clearly grown. Still, the message was loud and clear. American soldiers, industry, and ideals could shape world events. Though hesitant to embrace leadership fully, the seeds of superpower status had been sown. The world had taken notice, and the U.S. wouldn't stay on the sidelines for long. The 1920s exploded with energy. Cities buzzed with jazz, dance, and new technologies, while radios brought entertainment into every home. Cars, thanks to Henry Ford's assembly line, became affordable for the average family. Women gained the right to vote, and Harlem became the epicenter of a cultural revolution. It was a time of optimism, excess, and ambition. But beneath the glamour, cracks were forming. Farmers struggled with debt, and the stock market became a casino powered by borrowed money. Banks operated with little regulation, and speculation spiraled. In 1929, the bubble burst, the stock market crashed, triggering a financial catastrophe that shook the entire nation. Banks failed, businesses closed, and millions lost jobs and homes. The Great Depression had begun, the worst economic collapse in U.S. history. Suddenly, the nation that had been celebrating its success faced widespread poverty. Soup kitchens, dust storms, and bread lines replaced the parties and the promises of endless prosperity. The crash didn't just shake the economy, it shook confidence in capitalism itself. How could a country that seemed so strong collapse so fast? The answer would redefine the role of government and reshape American society for decades. In the depths of the Great Depression, Americans turned to a bold leader, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Elected in 1932, FDR promised a New Deal to bring hope and help to millions. His approach was revolutionary. Instead of letting the market fix itself, the government would take action, creating new agencies and programs to stabilize lives and rebuild confidence. The CCC put young men to work in forests, while the WWII built roads, schools, and hospitals. Social Security provided a safety net for the elderly, changing expectations of public support. Roosevelt didn't just offer jobs, he offered vision. His fireside chats on the radio made Americans feel heard, even in their darkest moments. Critics called it socialism, but to many, it felt like salvation. While the economy didn't fully recover until World War II, the New Deal changed the relationship between government and citizens forever. Washington was now expected to step in during crises, to stabilize, support, and steer. Americans didn't just survive the Depression, they reimagined what their future could look like. FDR's leadership didn't just save a nation, it redefined what government could do. That shift helped prepare the U.S. for an even greater global challenge ahead. On December 7, 1941, everything changed. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the nation and ended decades of isolationism. The United States entered World War II, and with it began its true transformation into a superpower. Mobilization was swift and massive, reshaping industry, society, and national purpose. Factories shifted to war production, building planes, tanks, and ships at unprecedented speeds. Millions enlisted, and women joined the workforce in record numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. The U.S. became the arsenal of democracy, supplying the Allies with critical support. On the battlefield, American forces played key roles, from storming Normandy to island hopping in the Pacific. At home, the war united a fractured nation under a common cause. Yet it also exposed deep contradictions. Japanese Americans were interned and black soldiers fought abroad while facing segregation at home. Still, by 1945, America emerged victorious and vastly changed. It had the world's strongest economy, unmatched industrial might, and a nuclear arsenal. The war had not only ended tyranny abroad, it had vaulted the U.S. into global leadership. From this moment on, America wasn't just powerful. It was essential. Victory in World War II didn't bring peace. It brought tension. As Europe lay in ruins, two superpowers stood tall, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their ideologies, democracy versus communism, were incompatible, and a new kind of war began, the Cold War. There were no direct battles, but conflict was everywhere. The Iron Curtain fell across Europe, and the U.S. created NATO to contain Soviet influence. The Soviets responded with their own bloc, and the world hardened into rival camps. Arms races escalated. Espionage became normal, and fear of nuclear annihilation spread. At home, the Red Scare sparked accusations, blacklists, and paranoia. Abroad, the U.S. rebuilt Europe via the Marshall Plan, but also intervened in Korea, Vietnam, and Latin America to stop communism's spread. The Cold War defined America's foreign policy, economy, and culture for decades. It fueled innovation, the space race, and tech revolutions, but also anxiety and long, costly conflicts. The U.S. became a global guardian of democracy, yet in trying to protect the free world, it often found itself entangled in complicated wars with lasting consequences. The 1950s brought prosperity and comfort to millions of Americans. Returning soldiers used the GI Bill to buy homes, go to college, and start families, accelerating a new era of stability. Suburbs exploded, and the white picket fence became a symbol of the American dream. Shopping malls, highways, and television reshaped daily life, while a new middle class grew confident and proud. But this golden age wasn't for everyone. Segregation kept black families out of many neighborhoods, and women were pushed back into domestic roles after filling jobs during the war. Still, for many Americans, it felt like success. Manufacturing boomed, cars filled driveways, and kids grew up on sitcoms and TV dinners, surrounded by messages of national greatness. This prosperity helped cement the U.S. as a cultural force worldwide. Hollywood, Coca-Cola, and rock and roll became global symbols, exporting American lifestyle and confidence. While the Cold War raged quietly in the background, many Americans believed they were living in the best country on earth, and for the first time they were told that daily. The 1950s and 60s weren't just about prosperity, they were about protest. Despite America's global image as a beacon of freedom, millions of its own citizens were denied basic rights. The civil rights movement erupted to demand justice. Black Americans, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X, marched, boycotted, and risked their lives. From the Montgomery bus boycott to the March on Washington, nonviolent protests captured national attention. Violent backlash from police, mobs, and even the government made the struggle painfully clear. But change began. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 were hard-won victories, forcing legal progress after decades of systematic exclusion. Television broadcast the brutality, fire hoses, dogs, and bombs, forcing Americans to confront the truth. The movement inspired others: women's rights, native rights, Latino activism, and LGBTQ+ protests. America had promised liberty and justice for all, and now it was being held accountable. This reckoning wasn't just moral. It was necessary for a nation claiming global leadership. As the U.S. tried to stop communism in Southeast Asia, it walked into one of the most divisive wars in its history, Vietnam. What began as support turned into full-scale conflict. Hundreds of thousands of American troops were deployed, but victory never came. Dense jungles, unfamiliar terrain, and a determined enemy made progress slow, costly, and deeply uncertain. At home, Americans grew disillusioned. Televised images of body bags, massacres like My Lai, and relentless bombings triggered outrage, pushing the war into living rooms nationwide. Students protested, draft cards burned, and Kent State became a symbol of how deeply divided the nation had become. Trust in government eroded as anger spread across generations. The Pentagon Papers and the Watergate scandal revealed deception at the highest levels, deepening skepticism. By 1975, U.S. forces withdrew, and Saigon fell. The war cost over 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese. More than that, it shook America's belief in itself and forced painful questions about power and purpose. Vietnam marked the end of blind faith in government and the beginning of a more skeptical, divided era. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan stepped into the Oval Office with a bold promise to restore American confidence and strength. After the turmoil of the 60s and 70s, his message of patriotism, prosperity, and power resonated. He slashed taxes, deregulated industries, and ramped up military spending, believing that a stronger economy and a stronger defense would revitalize America and defeat the Soviet Union. His famous call to Mr. Gorbachev, "Tear down this wall," became a defining moment. Behind the scenes, diplomacy with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev thawed decades of hostility. By 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. 2 years later, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War was over, and the U.S. stood alone as the world's sole superpower. But Reagan's legacy was complex. His policies boosted economic growth, but also deepened inequality. He's remembered as a communicator, a cold warrior, and a symbol of conservative resurgence. For many, Reagan's era marked a return to American dominance, a powerful nation, unapologetic in its values, and once again leading the global conversation on freedom, markets, and democracy. As the Cold War ended, a different revolution was already underway, one powered not by missiles, but microchips. The 1990s ushered in the rise of the Internet, transforming communication, commerce, and culture. Silicon Valley became the new frontier, birthing companies like Microsoft, Apple, and later Google and Amazon. Personal computers entered homes. Email replaced letters. Entire industries were disrupted overnight. The U.S. led this digital explosion, exporting not just technology, but a new way of life. The economy boomed during the dot-com years. The U.S. became the epicenter of global innovation. But the digital age also brought challenges: job displacement, privacy concerns, and widening inequality. Still, America's tech dominance reinforced its superpower status. From Hollywood to hardware, the world consumed UC-made content, devices, and ideas. The digital age made borders blur, but America's influence only grew stronger. Power was no longer just about armies or oil, it was about code, connectivity, and culture. And for a time it seemed the United States had mastered all three. On September 11, 2001, America was attacked in a way it had never imagined. Terrorists from Al-Qaeda hijacked planes, striking the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost. In response, the U.S. launched the War on Terror, a defining chapter in 21st century history. Troops invaded Afghanistan to dismantle Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, claiming Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. These wars reshaped global politics and U.S. foreign policy. They also cost trillions of dollars and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. At home, security tightened. The Patriot Act expanded surveillance powers. Islamophobia surged. The nation was united in grief, then divided over strategy. While Osama bin Laden was eventually killed in 2011, the wars dragged on. By the time U.S. forces left Afghanistan in 2021, questions lingered. Was it worth it? What had America achieved? 9/11s didn't just scar the nation. It transformed how America saw itself, how it wielded power, and how it balanced freedom with fear. Just as Americans were adjusting to a post-9/11 world, another shock hit, this time economic. In 2008, Wall Street collapsed under the weight of bad mortgage, risky loans, and reckless speculation. Big banks failed. The stock market plummeted. Millions lost homes, jobs, and savings. It was the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The government stepped in with massive bailouts. In 2009, Barack Obama became the first black president in U.S. history, a historic moment that symbolized both progress and challenge. He inherited a broken economy and launched the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act to jumpstart growth. Slowly, the economy rebounded. The auto industry was saved. Unemployment dropped. But the crisis deepened mistrust in elites, banks, and government. The Occupy Wall Street movement captured this anger with the rallying cry of "We are the 99%. Meanwhile, tech giants grew larger than ever. America recovered, but not evenly. The seeds of political polarization, populism, and resentment were planted. The U.S. was still powerful, but its unity and its economic fairness were under strain. As the 2010s ended and the 2020s began, the United States stood at a crossroads. On one hand, it was still the world's largest economy, a hub of innovation and home to unmatched military power. On the other, it faced deep internal divisions. Racial justice protests surged after the killing of George Floyd. Political polarization reached historic levels. A global pandemic tested healthcare systems, leadership, and trust in institutions. Yet through crisis, the U.S. also showed resilience. Vaccines were developed at record speed. Businesses adapted. SpaceX launched astronauts into orbit, reigniting dreams of exploration. The conversation around climate change, AI, and renewable energy moved to the forefront. But geopolitical rivals like China rose rapidly, challenging U.S. dominance in trade, tech, and diplomacy. The world was no longer unipolar. Still, the U.S. remained a cultural, economic, and ideological force. Its greatest strength, reinvention, was once again being tested. Would America fracture under pressure, or redefine what superpower status means in a multipolar world? The next chapter, as always, would depend on what Americans chose to build, together or apart. One of the most overlooked but powerful aspects of American dominance is its culture. From Hollywood blockbusters to hip-hop beats, from fast food to fashion, American culture has reached nearly every corner of the globe. The English language, heavily influenced by American slang, dominates international business, science, and entertainment. Movies, music, and memes from the U.S. shape global trends, values, and even politics. This cultural soft power amplifies America's global influence in ways tanks and treaties never could. People from distant countries who've never visited the U.S. still know its songs, dream of its cities, or wear its brands. This emotional connection matters. It creates goodwill, spreads ideas, and reinforces American ideals: freedom, individuality, reinvention. But this influence also brings scrutiny. The same platforms that share American dreams also reveal its flaws. Racism, inequality, and political dysfunction are now globally visible. Still, few nations have the cultural gravity America possesses. It's not just about what America does, it's about what it symbolizes, and that symbolism is a superpower in its own right. The story of how America rose from colonies to superpower isn't just about wars, presidents, or policies. It's about mindset. It's about risk-taking, reinvention, and resilience. Again and again, America has faced crises: civil war, depression, terror, division, and found ways to adapt, rebuild, and often emerge stronger. But that rise has come at a cost. Indigenous displacement, slavery, foreign interventions, and inequality stain the record. To understand America's rise fully, we must hold both truths, its promise and its problems. What makes the U.S. unique is not perfection, it's the constant tug-of-war between its ideals and its actions, between we the people and the ever-changing definition of who the people are. As America looks ahead, the same forces that built it, ambition, innovation, courage, protest, will shape what comes next. The lesson isn't that the U.S. was destined to lead, but that it chose to evolve, fight, and imagine something bigger. The question now isn't how it rose, it's how and if it can rise again. No empire, however vast, stays on top forever, and the United States today faces challenges that would test any nation. China's rapid rise in technology, infrastructure, and global alliances threatens U.S. economic dominance. Cyber warfare, misinformation, and political instability weaken trust in democracy. Climate change disrupts economies, displaces people, and redefines national security. At home, polarization paralyzes progress. Infrastructure crumbles. Disparities in health, wealth, and opportunity grow. Yet, unlike past empires, the U.S. has a unique advantage: the power to change course. Its democratic foundations allow for reinvention. Its immigrant spirit welcomes fresh talent. Its culture thrives on disruption, but nothing is guaranteed. To remain a superpower, America must re-earn it, not just with power, but with purpose. It must balance competition with cooperation, ambition with ethics, and innovation with inclusion. The challenges are immense, but so is the potential. What comes next depends not just on leaders in Washington, but on the choices made in classrooms, startups, streets, and small towns. Superpowers aren't preserved, they're rebuilt. Every nation tells a story about itself. America's story, the land of opportunity, the defender of freedom, the melting pot, has inspired millions. That myth has power. It invites people to dream, to risk, to build. It's what made immigrants cross oceans. It's what sent rockets to the moon. But myths can blind as much as they can guide. The belief in American exceptionalism has led to triumphs and to arrogance. Still, there's something enduring in the mission to create a more perfect union, to stand for liberty, to lead not by force, but by example. Whether America lives up to that mission is always up for debate. But the idea, the belief that progress is possible, that tomorrow can be better than today, is a fuel that few nations possess at such scale. That belief is deeply embedded in the American psyche, and that's why even in chaos, people still look to America not for perfection, but for possibility. The myth lives on because it continues to evolve. So what really makes a superpower? Is it armies, markets, or machines? Maybe, but the story of America's rise suggests something deeper: imagination. The imagination to build something from scratch, to question kings, to reinvent identity, to send people into space, to create technologies that didn't exist, to tell stories that touch the world. America's journey from colony to superpower is at its core a story of belief. Belief in systems, in rights, in change. And yes, belief in itself. That belief has wavered at times. It's been shaken by conflict, tested by division, and scarred by injustice. But it endures not because it's unbreakable, but because it's continually rebuilt. Every generation redefines what America means. That's the true superpower. Not just to rise once, but to rise again and again. The question for the future isn't just whether the U.S. can hold on to power, but whether it can continue to inspire. Because in a world of shifting powers and rising rivals, the nation that tells the most compelling story may still lead. And America's story, unfinished as it is, isn't over yet.